Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Zach Smith, and I'll be starting off our presentation. This is an introduction to our new Grid 2.0 measures. Some of you might have watched our presentation back in April when we went over these measures. This webinar is going to be geared a little bit more towards IT vendors, billing companies that work with your facilities, but I think it's also going to be useful to our grid users and our MIPS users as well. So feel free to stick around for this webinar. We'll send the recording out to everybody afterwards. You can always forward that recording to your vendors if you'd like them to take a look at it too. So first, I'm going to go over what we're going to cover. I wanted to let everybody know you can use the questions tab on your GoToWebinar. You can type questions to us. We'll be responding to those through the webinar. And then at the end, if we have some time for Q&A, we'll answer some questions out loud. And we can also unmute you if you want to hit the hand raise icon. So you can do that at the end, and we can unmute your line and have you ask your questions there. So what we're going to cover today, we're going to talk a little bit about the measure development process when we created these measures. We're going to go over the descriptions of all 11 measures and then talk about their data elements. We're going to talk about the benefits of adopting the measures early and helping ACR with the testing process. Then we're going to go a little bit more into the data submission process, both the flat file upload and the web services upload. And then we're going to review the updated data templates and have some time for Q&A after that. So to start off, these measures began the development process in about 2017 and 2018. We convened two different technical expert panels, or TEPs as we call them, and the purpose of those TEPs was to develop new quality measures for diagnostic radiology. Both of these TEPs were a team of cross-specialty multidisciplinary physicians, and the primary goals of these two TEPs was to develop measures that were focused on communication of exam findings, standardizing communication of information in final reports, optimizing follow-up recommendations, and also use of structured reporting and use of low-dose CT. And beginning in 2020, these 11 new measures were added to the GRID registry. Sorry, I think my slides got messed up there. So starting in 2020, we added these measures to the GRID registry. So as of January of this year, they were available for reporting. Now we did have to change the data submission template a bit to accommodate these new measures. And when I go over the measures, I think you'll see what I mean. We have new data elements that we need to collect in order to calculate these measures. So we updated the data template, and this is where the GRID 2.0 concept comes from. Now, 7 of these 11 measures were approved by CMS to be QCDR measures for 2020. So that's only relevant to people that are participating in the MIPS program. But if you are participating in MIPS, you can submit these measures through the GRID registry and then get credit for your MIPS participation. So 7 of these measures are available for MIPS, and you only have to have 6 measures total. And that's in addition to the GRID turnaround time measures that are already QCDR measures and are available for MIPS reporting. And when I send the slides out to everybody after this webinar, you can click this link here, but that link will take you to a more detailed list of all the measures. You can pour through the descriptions, the data elements, and all that stuff. So what I'm going to show you in the next few slides is sort of a summary of each of the measures. But if you want to see the detailed list, you can click that link there and get a little more information. So the first new measure that we've added to the GRID registry is recommended follow-up for imaging findings. So this measure is essentially it's the percentage of final reports for all patients with follow-up imaging recommendations all of the final reports that contain an impression or a conclusion that includes the modality and the time interval or time range for the recommended follow-up imaging. So the denominator for that measure is all final reports, regardless of modality, where there is a recommendation for follow-up imaging. And then the numerator, in other words, the way that you meet performance for that measure, is if that final report includes the modality and the recommended time range for follow-up imaging. And of course, like many measures, there are some exclusions. So patients with an active diagnosis of cancer, lung cancer screening patients are excluded from that measure. So if you look on the table to the left, you'll see a list of the data elements that are required for calculating that measure. And each of these measures is going to be a little bit different, but this will kind of give you an idea of what these new data elements that we're collecting are, so that you'll know what you need to submit to us in order to be able to use that measure for either GRID or for MIPS participation. So for the denominator, we need to know if there was a recommendation for follow-up in the final report. We need to know the modality of the exam that was performed and the place of service. That'll help us calculate the denominator. For the numerator, we'll need to know the recommended follow-up imaging modality, if there was one, and the recommended follow-up imaging interval, if there was one. And then, of course, for the exclusion, we need to know the medical history, such as diagnosis of cancer, lung cancer screening, something like that. So those are the data elements for calculating measure 1. So just keep that in mind as we go through the next 10 measures. I'm not going to go super in depth on the data elements for all of these, but I think by looking at the denominator and numerators, you'll be able to kind of have an idea of what's going to be required for calculating these measures. So measure 2, this is follow-up CT imaging for incidental pulmonary nodules according to recommended guidelines. This is actually the same as MIPS measure 364. So this is a measure you can submit through GRID, and the data that you submit through GRID can be used to participate in measure 364. The next 2 measures are also a similar deal with those, where the next 2 measures are the 2 components of measure 405, which is the abdominal mass, abdominal incidental finding measure. So for this measure, the description is percentage of final reports with a finding of an incidental pulmonary nodule that contain an impression or conclusion that includes recommended interval and modality for follow-up. So that's kind of similar to the first measure. We need to know if the patient was having a CT study, was there an incidental pulmonary nodule, and was the patient age 35 or older. And of course, for the numerator, we need to know if that final report included an impression or conclusion with a recommended interval and modality for follow-up, and if it also included the source of recommendations for the follow-up recommendation or the recommendation against follow-up. And again, that's no different from measure 364. This is just a different way you can submit data for that measure. So these next 2 measures are, like I said, they're part of measure 405, which is the overall abdominal incidental mass measure. That measure is currently, the denominator is both adrenal incidental masses and renal masses. So what we're trying to do is split that measure into 2 separate measures, because we think it just makes more sense to have adrenal as one measure and renal as one measure. So just like the previous measure for the pulmonary nodules, you can submit the renal mass measure and the adrenal mass measure through the GRID registry and get credit for MIPS measure 405. Hopefully in future years, we'll be able to actually split that MIPS measure into 2 new measures, so that they'll just be 2 entirely separate measures. We think that would be more beneficial to people who are reporting it, and would also give you 2 measures to report rather than 1 measure like it currently is. So I'm not going to go over these 2 measures too much in detail, because you're probably already familiar with measure 405, but essentially it's percentage of final reports for CT or MRI that include an incidental finding of a renal mass and a recommendation for no follow-up imaging based on the findings. So that's the renal mass measure. Then measure 4 is essentially the same thing, but for adrenal masses. So it's looking to see if there was a mass of a certain size that was either smaller than 1 centimeter or classified as likely benign, and if that final report included a recommendation for no follow-up imaging. The next few measures here are entirely new measures, and they're all part of the QCDR measures for 2020. So any of the ones that I've marked with an asterisk here are new QCDR measures. So these are the ones we really want you to pay attention to and that we're really trying to get data submitted for, because we'd like to be able to submit these as MIPS measures for the call for measures that's going on right now. So this is interpretation of CT pulmonary angiography for pulmonary embolism. The description is the percentage of final reports for patients undergoing CTPA with a finding of pulmonary embolism that specifies the branching order level of the embolus. So for that measure, we want to know if it was a patient aged 18 or older who was undergoing CT pulmonary angiography, and if there was a finding of PE. That's to calculate the denominator. And then for the numerator, we need to know if that final report specified the branching order as stated below. The next QCDR measure is incidental coronary artery calcification reported on chest CT. So this is the percentage of final reports for patients undergoing non-cardiac chest CT that note the presence or absence of coronary artery calcification. So for this measure, we need to know there's 2 different age ranges. For male patients, it's 18 to 50. For female, it's 18 to 65. We need to know if it was a non-cardiac, non-contrast chest CT or a with and without contrast chest CT. And then we need to know for the numerator if that final report included a note of the presence or absence of coronary artery calcification. Measure 7, the next QCDR measure, is the use of structured reporting in prostate MRI. So this measure is the percentage of reports for patients undergoing prostate MRI for prostate cancer screening or surveillance that includes a reference to a validated scoring system such as PIRADS. So pretty straightforward measure. The denominator is all the final reports for male patients 18 and older who are undergoing prostate MRI. And then the numerator is whether that final report included a reference to a scoring system such as PIRADS. Measure 8, this is surveillance imaging for liver nodules. This is the percentage of reports with findings of liver nodules for patients with hepatitis B or cirrhosis who are undergoing screening. And it's basically trying to make sure those patients are receiving ultrasound follow-up imaging rather than some other type of modality of imaging within the recommended interval, which is 3 to 6 months. So the denominator would be those ultrasound reports with a finding of a nodule for a patient with hepatitis B or cirrhosis who's undergoing screening. And then the numerator is whether that final report includes a specific recommendation for follow-up with ultrasound imaging within 3 to 6 months. So again, these are all data elements that we need to collect to be able to calculate this measure. So just think about this as we're going through. If it's something that you're not sure whether you'd be able to pull from your medical record, that would be a conversation to have with the IT vendor that you work with. And if you are a vendor listening to this, just try to be thinking about ways that you could help your facilities pull this information out so that they could report these measures. Next, this is the use of quantitative criteria for FDG PET imaging. This is the percentage of final reports for non-CNS oncologic FDG PET that include the following items at minimum. So pretty straightforward measure. It's patients who are undergoing those types of FDG PET studies for the denominator, and then the numerator is whether those final reports included those items listed above. And the next 2 measures are about the use of low-dose CT for certain types of imaging and screening. So this one is for patients aged 18 or younger with a ventricular shunt undergoing cranial imaging to evaluate for shunt malfunction. The denominator is patients that are undergoing imaging for ventricular shunt malfunction, and then the numerator is patients who were given low-dose cranial CT or MRI. So this is about reducing radiation exposure for patients undergoing imaging. And then the final measure, also a QCDR measure, is similar. This is for patients with renal stones who are undergoing CT imaging of the abdomen or pelvis, who are receiving low-dose CT. So those are the 11 new measures. I hope those kind of make sense to everybody. I hope you can see how they would be useful for reporting. Again, those final 7 measures that I went over are all part of the QCDR for 2020, and we've submitted these to CMS as part of the call for measures, and we're hoping that they can be added as MIPS measures in the future, but at the very least, they'll continue to be QCDR measures for as long as we can keep them on there. But what we have to have in order to keep those measures and to potentially get them turned into MIPS measures is we have to have testing data from facilities such as such as yourselves. So we need to be getting as much data as we possibly can between now and roughly the end of August, because we have until September 4th to submit testing data for the call for measures. So if you think that you're going to be submitting these measures to the QCDR for your 2020 MIPS participation, for example, or if you're just a grid facility who is interested in submitting these measures, then please contact us. You can email us at nrdrsupport@acr.org, and we can try to help you get set up as quickly as possible to start submitting data. Like I said earlier, if you're a facility user who's watching this webinar and you're interested in getting these measures into your grid reports, then go ahead, send this webinar recording to your IT vendors. Let them know that you're interested in submitting these measures, because the earlier you can get this started, the more likely you'll be able to get the measures ready for submission for 2020, and the more likely we'll be able to get testing data to make sure we can continue pushing these measures to become MIPS measures. So again, nrdrsupport@acr.org if you're interested in these measures. And that's going to end my part of the webinar. I'm going to hand things over to Ryan Kiefer, who's going to talk about exam level data submission. So thanks a lot, Ryan.
Thanks, Zach. We're going to look at things a little bit more on the vendor focus with good reason. So you have a couple of different ways for files to be submitted. As Zach alluded to, there's the flat file or batch upload, in which case a vendor would go ahead and extract your exam data to an Excel file that you could go ahead and that the facility can go ahead and upload to our web portal. Or you can also go ahead and do vendor authorized transmission, which is done through our web services connection program. Next slide. The file upload specifications, or the file upload details, are fairly easy. It's an Excel file which can be created in-house by your facilities. We also have a pre-formatted template that you can go ahead and use that's on our web portal as well. And there are vertical bars that serve to separate the data elements and serve as like a delimiter. And there's a little bit of an added wrinkle when it comes to grid submissions, and this actually applies to our other registries as well, if anybody is participating in our other registries. When you do submit through a file upload and you get the log file that shows you what the errors are, the log file, when you download it, can actually be used to resubmit your file. So you can go ahead and make the corrections on that log file, save it as a new file name, and then submit those corrections. And it's a pretty quick, or it's a quicker process that we have now. Next slide. And web services, certified vendors can create compatible files for transmission to us. There's an authentication service, and we also have a test environment available if needed. When you do have vendors that do want to use the test environment, a couple of things that we want to ask is make sure that you have a front-facing IP address, so then that way we can go ahead and use that for whitelisting purposes. And we also ask that when you do use the test environment, any data that you're using as part of submissions for the test environment remain test data and be anonymized or de-identified. Excuse me. And then at the bottom you have some of the vendors that we currently have that are certified for web services. New data elements include patient demographics, height, weight, BMI, a little bit more exam information, incidental and follow-up reporting. Just to kind of stress here, the information is optional, but the data elements must be represented in order for measures to be calculated. And then we have a measures document that's in part of our knowledge base that I'll kind of segue to in a moment. And just underneath that is a sample file that kind of illustrates data elements that are without values. If it was an Excel file that you would be using, then you would just have empty columns between those data elements. The one thing that I do want to go ahead and note when it comes to grid, we currently have a couple of different exam versions at the moment. We're going to be transitioning to use Grid 2.0 exclusively beginning in 2021, which is to say, if you're submitting via Grid in some of these earlier Grid versions, you want to go ahead and make those accommodations for the new elements anyway. So that's something to kind of bear in mind as well. Next slide, Zach. The resources that we have here. Freshdesk is our knowledge base, as I mentioned. It's got all of our core documents for Grid that get into the measures. It gets into the reference documents for data file submissions, and it has upload templates, CPT codes, file specs, things like that. The one other thing I want to go ahead and mention here as well, if you do decide to go ahead and distribute to vendors, we actually do have a separate article that I didn't include in here that's authentication documents for our web services, and it kind of gets into tokens and the protocols for submission, which I think King may be getting into in a moment. That article on the authentication documents is also available on our knowledge base, and we're usually adding and maintaining content there on a near daily basis. So it's something that we encourage sites and vendors to check on frequently. And web services, I think that's over to King now.
Thank you, Ryan. Okay, so for the next few minutes, I'm going to go over some of the highlights of the web services. So if you choose not to log in every time you want to upload a file, you can choose to integrate to our web services, the APIs that we have for Grid. As Ryan mentioned earlier, that you do have to go through the authentication process, which is what we call right now is ACR SSO Authentication Service. It was previously called as ACR Connect Service. So in some of the documents that you're going to download from our NRDS support site, you may still see ACR Connect being referenced in some of the documents, and we're in the process of making that changes. So there are actually 4 parts of the web services. One, you need to authenticate, going through the ACR SSO services, in which you will receive tokens, and using the refresh and access token, then you will submit data with the access token. And finally, you want to get your submission status back. So the status will let you know what went wrong during the submission. It tells you how many records are submitted, how many are being rejected, and if they are rejected, the status will also show you the error that's being rejected, so that you could find a way to correct them. So here in the little diagram on the slide, it shows you the 4 steps. So 1, connecting to the ACR SSO service, getting authenticated. and which you would use that service to also retrieve the token. Then you send the data along with the token to the NRDL grid API, and finally you request a transmission status back. We do have a window to hold the incoming data for approximately a day before I can process them. So we put it in a holding tank, and usually we have a process once 3 a.m. in the morning to process all the incoming data. So as soon as you submit the data, you will receive a return code saying that we received your submission, but then it doesn't mean that the data has been processed. So you will be running a method to get the data on the next day. Next slide, please. Okay, so here's some information about the ACR SSO Authentication Services. It's built on top of the OpenID Connect protocol. Will provide you a client ID, client secret. These are your credentials, so you have to keep it in a safe place. Use those to connect to the API and to receive the tokens, which are the refresh and access tokens. The refresh token live about for 6 months. So anytime you come in, you submit a submission via the API, it will automatically renew the token. So in theory, you only have to log in the first time using the client ID, client secret. Log in the first time, get the token. And from that point on, you can just keep on using refresh token. Each time you use a refresh token, it will get refreshed or renew for another 6 months. So as long as you submit data to us like on a regular basis, you should be okay. Unless we're going through there may be like a maintenance window that we have to shut down the service, in which case you may have to re-log in and authenticate yourself again. The link down below, it tells you the authentication document that Ryan was mentioning earlier. So go ahead and, after the call, you can just click on the link, take a look at the document, and it will give you a lot of information on how to establish the connection or this handshaking using the OpenID Connect protocol. Next, please. And here's just another diagram to emphasize the handshaking between your program and the ACR Connect services along with the grid API. So you would need to build an application or service on your end. What it does is basically using the OpenID protocol to get the token. Once you have the token, you just submit the data along with the token, the access token, and then send the data to the NRDL API, which will perform the validation on the data, on the token, and also on the data that you submitted. And finally, you would also want to use the GET method, which I will emphasize a little bit on the next couple of slides to get the data, to get the result back. Next, please. So here's just one example, and you can find all these examples in the documents, which they will be listed on the few slides down. So this is a post method. Use the post method to post a submission. So what I'm highlighted there on the slide in red is the endpoint for our sandbox environment. So the data is in the JSON schema. So you will have to format your data in JSON. And this is just one way of doing this submission. You can choose your own programming language to fit your need. Next, please. And then this is the GET method, which you use it to retrieve the status or any error that may happen during the submission. So again, the document that I showed you later in the next slides will give you a lot more information on that. Next, please. So the documentation here, the link above on the slide, there you actually will see a page which And you scroll down on that page, you'll see a few documents on the bottom of that page. So this is an outline of what each document contains. So the first document is called the NRDL Grid Exam Data Exchange document. It will give you the endpoint of our sandbox environment. It shows you the handshaking between, I showed you how to submit data. It shows you the JSON schema, and also a list of errors that you may encounter during the submission. The next document, Grid JSON Mapping, has a 2019 day, November 12th. This is actually for 1.2, which I don't really recommend you go to it if you choose to. If you're interested in 1.2, you can still look into it, but then 2.0 is going to be the next version, which will be available. It's already available in production right now, and 1.2 is going to be retired by the end of this year. So if you want to do the submission using the API call, I recommend you just go right into the next document, which is the Grid JSON Mapping 2.0 document. It will list all the data elements for 2.0, and it will have a mapping between the data elements and the JSON schema. Next, please. So on our preview environment, some of you may already familiar with this environment. If you're doing other web services such as LCSR, this is a lockdown environment, which means we do not open it to outside, except that if you give us your IP address, we'll whitelist it and let you into our environment. For testing, we'll provide you a test facility, credentials, including a client ID, client secret, and also we're going to provide support to guide you, in your process of getting the data into our system. I guess the best way to do it is to schedule a call with us. You can go to nrdlsupport.acr.org, or you can email us at nrdlsupport@acr.org. Just specify that you're interested in this group web service, and we'll have representative to set up a call with you and guide you through the process. Next slide. I think that concludes my presentation on the web services. A little high level, so I expect if you're interested in it, just send us an email or schedule a call with us, and we can go through all the detail with you. Thank you.
I think that brings it to me, right, Zach?
That's right. Thanks, Mike.
Okay. Hi, this is Mike Saman with Zach. If you can just advance to the next slide. So I'm going to kind of be the closer, I think, here. I'm going to go through, try to encourage you to submit these 2.0 elements and adopt the new format and send us the data, and convince you that it's not going to be too painful, and what steps we went through to hopefully ensure that. And then also to just give you give sites a little view into how we're going to use this data and how they'll see the measures in the future, or the very near future. And actually some of this is already available. We'll get to that. So as far as how the attempt we made to make this as easy as possible, and that's shown in this little screenshot. We've really tried to reuse elements or use elements multiple times, so that's not a major burden in collection. For instance, in this, for incidental mass types, there are a few measures that look at different aspects of different incidental masses, and we've looks like my screen. There we go. Oh, nope. There we go. We've tried to set it up so that one element can be used for multiple measures. So in this case, for incidental mass type, there's both the adrenal mass and a cystic renal mass that can be captured in the same element. And we'll talk about in a second that there's a set of elements for this particular element. There's a grouping of elements that are repeated together. But the idea is that rather than having to send us adrenal mass, yes, I had that, or yes, the patient had that, cystic renal mass, yes, the patient had that, thyroid nodule, yes, the patient had that, it can be done in one element. You can list multiple sets of observations in groups of elements, or in an individual element, such as the patient medical history. You can list many different conditions, and that's typically used in the exclusion. That patient will be excluded from the appropriate measures just based on one element, not based on having to send multiple medical histories in different fields. Next slide. So this is going to get more into what I was just mentioning. The first thing is, as Ryan mentioned, all the elements are optional. They're optional for submission in that you will not get a rejection as long as you the file that's sent has a open spot for where the element should be. It can be left blank. However, every element that we're asking for is used in at least one measure. So we're not asking you to send things strictly for research, or this is actually going to be used in a measure. So if you are intent on submitting all measures or seeing all measures, you would need to use every element at least in one point or another. Then the second portion of the second bullet here, this gets into the repeating section. There are three sets of repeating areas: incidental masses, follow-up imaging recommendations, and follow-up procedure recommendations. And when I say this, the section repeats, what I'm referring to there is if you have both a renal mass and an adrenal mass, you would indicate in incidental mass 1 type renal mass, incidental mass type size 1, incidental 1 mass size, the size of that renal mass, and incidental 1 mass impression, is that renal mass benign, malignant, etc. Then in incidental 2 mass type, you would put the cystic renal mass, and then the same thing with the mass size for the renal mass and the impression for the renal mass. So these sections are repeating, up to 5 for the masses, 3 for the imaging, 3 for the procedure recommendations. And the intent is, again, that those groupings can be used to report multiple things if necessary. If none of them apply, they would be blank, and that's totally fine. If there's only one, you only have to populate one. It's not, you just need to make sure that those fields are represented in the file. They don't actually have to have data. And then the key thing is at the bottom, ACR, we will calculate all the measures where the data is submitted. So as long as you've sent the data, you don't have to indicate, I want to have a grid measure for the adrenal mass calculated. We will automatically calculate that for you. That is not to say it will be used in MIPS. If you want to use it for MIPS, that you would need to select on your own. We will just show you in grid what your performance was for any eligible measure. Next slide, please. And that gets us to what's in it for you, or the sites. So we are in process of updating the quarterly reports that you already receive. The very next report hopefully will have 2 new turnaround time stratified by place of service and by number of readers. These are 2 elements that we added in July of last year, and now we have some significant data so that we can start doing some stratification on the turnaround time. So if you're interested in the turnaround time in your outpatient, in your inpatient, emergency department, etc., that will be in the quarterly report, as will a turnaround time by the number of readers, whether it's read by a single reader or multiple reader, which we're de facto kind of calling when a resident or a trainee is involved. You'll be able to see that in the quarterly reports. in this next version. If not, if we have a hiccup, it might be the Q3, but I'm pretty confident Q2 is going to happen. Then in the future, we are going to also add the 2.0 measures. But as of now, though, we've had the data available or the elements available since January. We really don't have any significant data available to do any reporting on this. So this is my plea, hint. We really need some folks to start submitting so we can make sure we've coded the measures, but without real data to make sure it's working correctly. We really need that in order to make that final step. So once we get some real data, we will hopefully be able to add those 2.0 measures to the quarterly report also. Next slide. In addition to the quarterly report, we just recently started rolling out interactive reports, and there are some that are available now. The benefit of these is it's near real time. You don't have to wait for the quarter to see how you're doing. It's more or less a daily refresh. There's more visual performance graphs and tables, so it's not really stale. You can see some color visualization of how you're performing. There's filtering capability. We can filter by dates, modality. There are other things as well. And then you can also download your own data for analysis. You're not downloading the whole registry data. You're downloading really your data and the benchmarks, so that you could do local analysis on your side if you want to. You hand it to physicians or your C-suite folks to look at some of your performance. You can download it from the online application. The exam, there's two reports now in particular. There's an exam search and a measures aggregate report. The exam search may be more applicable to the vendor group here, where you can actually see what exams came across each day, verify the completeness of the data, also the accuracy of the data. There is a particular tab for turnaround times with drill down into individual exams. So in this screenshot, I know it's kind of hard to tell, but on the bottom right, that's actually a negative turnaround time, which really doesn't make any sense. So you could, and actually, in fact, I think now we've prevented this, but just as an example, if maybe you have a really 30-day turnaround time and that's just impossible, you'll be able to drill down and see in an individual exam what seems out of whack, and maybe go investigate what happened. Is it a data entry issue, or is there really some kind of systemic problem? In the measures aggregate report, this is more of kind of what you're used to now in the quarterly reports, where it's a peer-to-peer comparison by the facility type, like academic facility, cancer hospital, etc., by your location, region. And you can see how you perform on mostly right now the turnaround time measures. There will be further stratification here, in that you can do two-level. You can do both the place of service and the number of readers. In the quarterly report, it's only one. It's turnaround time in the ER or turnaround time by one reader. The interactive reports will allow you to do turnaround time in the ER by one reader. So that second level of stratification can be done. And then again, once we get some real data, we hope that this will be where we will add the 2.0 measure, so that you can see the comparison against different hospitals, different your peer institutions, not the actual hospital names, but the peer institutions, and across the registry benchmarks. Next slide. So again, we've really tried to make the collection and passing of data as easy as possible. We have folks here that are happy to help you if either the vendors or individuals are having issues. Here's a way to get in touch with us, and we hope that you will take up the 2.0 measures as soon as you can, and again, use them just for GRID or for the MIPS program as you see fit. that's all I think I have. I think it's Q&A now, Zach, unless you wanted to add something.
Nope, we can go ahead and move to Q&A. I just want to thank everybody again for joining us today, and hopefully we'll get some questions. But yeah, the main message we want you to take away from this is that, you know, these measures are not too different from the MIPS measures that you're already familiar with. It's just sort of a different way of submitting the data to us. So we hope that you'll start looking into how to start pulling this data and how to get it submitted to us. We're really eager to see how people perform and to start benchmarking these measures for you know, quality assurance purposes. So let's go ahead and move on to Q&A. We've got Judy Burleson on the line too. I know she's been looking at the questions. So if there's anything you want to call out, Judy, just let us know.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, hey.
Hi. Yeah, I think maybe one question that we did receive, which probably is in the topmost of a lot of people's minds, is how exactly locally you're going to be able to get the data, which most of which is contained in, at least for the numerator portion of the measures, is contained in the radiology report. So of course that poses some issues in being able to collect that in a systematic way, recognizing that it could be quite burdensome to do such if there aren't some standardized processes in place or tools, informatics, IT solutions that have been created, such as using natural language processing or macros or structured elements within a reporting and dictation system, that it could be difficult to get the data to submit for these measures. And we totally get that and understand that as a hurdle to cross. And that's part of our goal in submitting these as to CMS as MIPS measures, where the structure of reporting is somewhat different, where CMS will develop G codes and CPT codes would be used more in a standardized way to assist in collecting the data, developing macros, having billing and coding management staff have use processes that they may already have in place for the current MIPS measures that are similar to what's being collected. All I can say is we totally respect that and are working with our the ACR informatics teams and other vendors to develop algorithms that may support collecting of this data. Not there yet, but that is efforts that are underway and that we are working on in concert with some reporting vendors, dictation vendors, and also building tools that could be utilized from downloading from ACR. So I think that maybe why we don't have a lot of questions actually is that there's that first step. If there's anyone, any of the attendees that have thoughts or questions related to that, we certainly would welcome hearing from you. I don't know, Zach, I don't think anyone has raised their hand, but if you do have something you'd like to ask or share, just raise your hand and we can unmute you.
Yeah, we'll give everybody just a minute to either get some questions in or get some hands raised. Thank you, Judy.
Mm-hmm. And if you don't wish to do that now, or you're thinking through how you might be able to do this for one or more of the measures and have questions, of course, you can contact us at a later time.
And we have a hand up here from Sushil. So I'm going to unmute you now, Sushil.
Hey, hi everyone. So I know the 11 measures which you guys are have for 2020. Do you guys have like have published any suggested procedure code or diagnosis or numerator things codes which we should look for these 11 measures?
So I believe we've got this posted in our Grid 2.0 resources page on the FreshDesk website. But if you're asking about, a list of CPT codes that are applicable to the denominators for these measures, we do have that. Yes.
Okay, and do that has been listed with the, because in the PPT you are mentioning it as a measure 1, 2, 3. So the CPT code list, is it mentioned with that same measure number, or with the different measure numbers in the list?
Yes. If you're asking if it's the exact same numbering as the way I presented them, that I'm not positive. I kind of grouped them by concept for this presentation, so it might be a little bit different. I mean, you can see which measures they're applicable to of the 11. So I think if you look at that document, it'll
Okay. I believe it's based on the modality codes then, right?
Yes.
Okay. Got it. Okay.
All right. Thank you. We do have a question here from Nicole, who's asking, you stated that measure 2 is similar to MIPS measure 364. Can we submit the same data for both? Yes, you can. You can continue to submit that measure through the MIPS portal like you have been, but you can also submit that data through the GRID registry. And what we'll do on our end is we'll show you a score based on what you've submitted for MIPS, and then a score based on what you've submitted through the GRID registry. I mean, obviously, if you're submitting the same data for both, they should be the same, but there could be some minor variance depending on how you're collecting the data for both methods. So you can choose which measure 364 you want to submit, whether it's the one that was pulled from your GRID data or the one that you submitted through the MIPS registry. So yeah, you can do it both ways. You can do it only one of the two ways if you prefer, but you can do both if you'd like to.
A similar question on point on that. So this is Sushil again. So you said like some of the measures are similar to 364 or 405. So do you have any slide or area on the website where it's represent that these 11 of these measures are similar to number of these MIPS measure?
So I know we have one document that we published. I believe it was more of a press release that we put out about the new measures. I mean, of these 11, the only ones that are applicable to existing MIPS measures are the pulmonary nodule measure and the renal and adrenal mass measures. So those abdominal incidental finding measures can be used for measure 405, and then the pulmonary nodule measure can be used for 364. So those are the only two that have that going for them.
Okay,
and
so
we can always add that to the documents to make that clearer.
Definitely.
And Zach, I'm sorry, you maybe stated this and I was entering a question and didn't hear, but the existing 406 is the abdominal imaging that contains both adrenal and renal lesions. And one of our goals was, and we have submitted to CMS the measures separate, the lesions in separate measures. So we have an adrenal and a renal measure separate. That was one of the intention. Did you already talk about that?
I did, yeah. But so yeah, just to reiterate, I mean, our goal is to replace measure 405 completely with two measures that are just sort of the denominator from 405 split apart, because right now it's two different anatomical areas, the adrenal and renal. I think we grouped them together initially just because it was, I don't know, we decided to submit them that way. CMS accepted it that way. But we've kind of come to realize after talking with some of our physicians and sort of poring over changes we could make to that measure to make it easier to report, that it would really make more sense as two entirely separate measures. So it wouldn't really change the reporting from the user perspective, but it would be beneficial because it would be two measures you could submit to MIPS rather than one measure. So yeah, we have high hopes for that. We just need to get testing data for the adrenal and renal measures so that we can provide that to CMS, and then hopefully they'll sort of appreciate our logic for separating that measure into two.
Okay.
And it doesn't look like we have any other questions. We've got a hand raised from Vicky, but I don't see Vicky available to unmute. So if you want to type your question real quick, Vicky, I'll read it out loud. Or you can, enter your PIN on your keypad and that'll make it so that I can unmute you. I'll give you just a minute for that. Okay, I'm not seeing anything yet. So I know we're 2 minutes from the hour, so I think we can go ahead and start wrapping up. If I happen to get a question in the next minute, I'll read it. But I wanted to remind everybody that we'll be sending the slides out. We'll send the recording out to everybody. So if you want to, review the slides or review the recording or send it out to your vendors or your colleagues, anything like that, then we'll get that to you. We'll try to post the link to the recording on our website as well. We'll try to put it on YouTube so that it's available for anybody. But yeah, we just really appreciate everybody tuning in. We'd love to get some questions from you. If you're interested in submitting these measures, then send us an email at nrdrsupport@acr.org. And yeah, that'll do it for today. Thank you so much and hope everybody has a great day. Thanks.
Thank you.